Thank you very much, Daniela, and also to the other organizers of the standing group for having me in this virtual webinar series. I will be probably talking for about 30 minutes, and I'll try not to go over time. But the more I thought about what I should present, the more things came to my mind. And I have to say, this is not a paper. There is no paper. There is just a talk and slides. But in the background, there is a book that I've been writing together with Gerd Falchers, an Austrian political scientist. And I just draw material from that book that is written in German. It's basically about my own country, Austria. I've been doing comparative and theoretical work on citizenship policies for quite a long time. But I've never been completely able to figure out, why Austria is such a strange case. So I'm testing this argument with you now. So it's not meant to be a general argument that creates generalizable hypotheses for lots of other countries. It's really trying to understand a specific case, but using the literature and the lenses from the general comparative literature. Okay, here. Yes. So that's the outline. The puzzle is basically that Austria is a high immigration country by all standards. But it has resisted liberalizing citizenship trends that we've seen in other Western democratic high immigration countries. And the question is why? So I will start very briefly by showing you some facts about Austria's immigration profile. Then I will talk a little bit longer about Austria's citizenship regime, basically its citizenship law and its regime on voting rights for migrants, and the effect of that blocked access to citizenship on the integration of immigrants and on democracy in Austria. And in the end, I will suggest three possible explanations, and that's the core of the argument. I would be very happy if you can add a fourth one or tell me one of them is wrong. So that will be about the political system, especially the party system. Secondly, about the nexus between immigration policy and citizenship policy. And thirdly, about the peculiar way how Austria has constructed its national identity post-World War II. And on the final slide, I will just speculate about possibilities of change that I still see. I'm an eternal optimist, but not in the very near future. So Austria's immigration profile, the share of the foreign-born population, so that's the proper statistics for measuring immigration, is 20% in Austria. If you look at the bar chart below, you will see that to the right hand with higher shares than Austria, there's just Sweden, Canada, Israel, New Zealand, Switzerland, Australia, and Luxembourg. Luxembourg, of course, very small country with lots of EU migrants, so let's leave that out. Austria is clearly in the group of the highest immigration intake countries in the OECD world. Now let's look at the population of the immigrants who are non-citizens. That includes now foreign-born as well as second and to a certain extent even third generations of immigrant origin. That's 17%. So very, very high compared to 20% immigration. You would think that many more of those 20% had already been turned into Austrian citizens. If you look at the largest groups by nationality among the non-citizens, you will see the top two bars are Germany and Romania. So this is intra-EU migration or mobility, as the EU prefers to call it, followed by Serbia and Turkey, which are the countries from which Austria recruited guest workers in the 1960s. But if you add to Serbia the ex-Yugoslavian countries of Bosnia and Croatia, you will see this is by far still the largest group, so more than the Germans too. This is now not immigration population, but non-nationals who have not acquired Austrian citizenship. And those from former Yugoslavia and those from Turkey are all stock immigrants. So they have been on average in the country for a very long time, which means that they qualify in terms of length of residence for citizenship but haven't taken it. So what are the basic features of Austria's citizenship law? The most important and first thing to point out is that it's squarely based on jus sanguinis, meaning citizenship is derived from descent from citizenship parents. Jus soli, which is co-present with jus sanguinis in nearly all countries around the world, is very weak in Austria. It's basically granted only to foundlings where you don't know the citizenship of the parents. There is another weak provision that you could call jus soli, which is those who are born in the territory can get so fast-track naturalization, but only after 6 years of continuous residence, plus lots of other conditions, basically the same other conditions as applied to immigrants who naturalize after 10 years. First generation immigrants. So second generation gets no privileged access apart from a reduction from 10 to 6 years. Ordinary naturalization, that is basically naturalization based on residence, requires 10 years of residence, as I've already pointed out. But that residence must be pretty continuous. So long interruptions where you go back home to take care of some family members set the clock back to 0. Apart from that, the other really important obstacles that apply also to most immigrants who can naturalize after 6 years are very high income requirements and astronomically high fees for getting citizenship, a strict renunciation requirement for your previous citizenship, so there's no toleration of dual citizenship, a very strict definition of what a clean criminal record means, a language test, and a civic knowledge test about Austrian historical facts and the constitution. However, you know, this type of access that we call ordinary naturalization is now used by only 10% of all naturalizations in 2020. That's a quite striking figure. You think it's ordinary, but it's a small minority to which it applies. And the reason is basically that it's so hard to go through that gate into citizenship that the categories that are left who do get access to citizenship are the special naturalization categories where the usual waiting period is 6 years. I've already mentioned birth in Austria. It applies also to citizens of the EU and EFTA countries. And there is a reward that you can get citizenship after 6 years for special integration achievements. For example, well, you must have German knowledge at a higher level, plus you can, for example, show that you have volunteered in the fire brigade in a village or something like this. So these are all taken together, all these 6 year special fast-track naturalization categories already make up 46%, nearly half of all naturalizations. Then there is a sizable category for extension to minor children or spouses. So one person gets naturalized, but the other persons get naturalized with them. And if you are married to an Austrian citizen, you can also get privileged access to citizenship, but with lots of conditions still attached. Dual citizenship is tolerated basically only if it's acquired at birth, either from parents with 2 different nationalities, or in the case of Austrians born abroad in a jus soli country like the US or Canada, they are Austrian citizens plus American citizens. It's also tolerated in a very limited category of special naturalizations, which is restoration for the Holocaust victims, where now also second generations are included, and not only the few surviving victims of the Holocaust. And there is an offer of Austrian citizenship for celebrities in the arts and sports, and for investors. There is a route to get Austrian citizenship through investing in the country. But there's no toleration of dual citizenship, both in incoming naturalizations, meaning immigrants, and in outgoing naturalizations, the Austrians who settle abroad and want to acquire citizenship of their host country. And with that non-toleration of dual citizenship, Austria is in a group of only 18% of states worldwide. We've done a count of 175 countries and found only 18 have the symmetric non-toleration of dual citizenship, and Austria is among them. So what does that mean in terms of assessing where Austria is in international comparison? Recently, MIPEX, the index published by the Migration Policy Group in Brussels, published its data for 2019. And that was even to me, that was surprising. Out of 52 countries, Austria and Bulgaria end up as those with the most restrictive citizenship regime. So here I've just listed the EU countries, but the list would be much longer if you see the whole sample. And still Austria and Bulgaria would be last. That has something to do with the indicators that go into MIPEX access to nationality. So it's, you know, if you calculate the index differently, Austria might end up a little bit further to the right. But still, I think substantively, the assessment is correct that Austria is in the group of the most restrictive countries. Now, here are a couple of slides that Gerd, I've already mentioned my co-author Gerd Falchers put together on the statistics of Austrian citizenship. Here you see the effect of the lack of use soli. So there are lots of children, second and even third generation, born in Austria as foreign nationals, and they grow up as foreign nationals there. It's now 1/5, 20% of all births in Austrian territory. Here is another slide about naturalizations, where you can see the red line is the share of foreign nationals in the resident population. I already mentioned it's now at 17%, but you see the continuous rise since throughout the 2000s. The blue line is the absolute numbers of naturalizations per year, and the orange line is the naturalization rate, meaning the number of people who acquire citizenship by naturalization divided by the number of foreign residents at the beginning of the same year. And what you see there, that since 2010, that number has been stagnating at the level of 0.7, which means 7 in 1,000. Only 7 out of 1,000 foreign residents changed their citizenship status by becoming Austrians. And in the last year, that has even dropped to 6 per 1,000, which may be partly related to corona effects. I wouldn't make guesses about this, but it certainly hasn't risen. Here are the naturalization rates in comparison with some other countries. You see Sweden, consistently much higher. You see Britain, Netherlands, Switzerland, the European Union average, and even Germany, which has more or less similar traditions as Austria, significantly higher rates than Austria has now. Of course, when we look at naturalization rates, we have to be a little bit cautious what they express, because the denominator in that fraction, number of naturalizations per year divided by the resident population at the beginning of the year, the denominator depends on migration dynamics, how many people have entered the country at what point in time and settled there. And it also depends on jus soli. If second generations become citizens at birth, then they don't show up in the denominator of the foreign resident population. So they are not eligible for naturalizing because they already have citizenship. So that needs to be taken into account when comparing these countries. It's a colleague, in an edited volume that is forthcoming on dual citizenship, calculated what's the number of eligible people among the immigrant stock in Austria. So he started out with the 10 years residence requirement. As we already heard, that is only the route for a minority of people, but that's what the law foresees. And he found out that 40% of the 1.5 million foreigners already are in the country for 10 years or longer. And if you divide this by EU, EFTA, and third countries, you will see that it's roughly half and half. A little bit less than half are EU origin and 55% are third country nationals. So these are the people who would meet the 10 years residence requirement. But there are other requirements, as I've just pointed out, and one of the most severe obstacles is the income requirement. Another colleague August Gechter calculated recently that 15% of the third country nationals with more than 10 years residence in Austria live in households that do not meet the income requirement because their regular, mostly wage-based income is too low to qualify for Austrian citizenship. And finally, there is the renunciation requirement, which has for the previous citizenship, which has a major deterrent effect. And it specifically lowers the naturalization propensity for EU and EFTA citizens. So my guess is EU citizens generally don't have a strong incentive to naturalize in an EU host country. But if you ask them to abandon their previous citizenship, then their propensity to naturalize declines very steeply. There was a recent survey only in Vienna now, last year, about interest in acquiring Austrian citizenship, where you see the stark contrast between EU citizens, where only 21% said, yes, I'm interested, and 57% said explicitly, no, I'm not interested. And it's the opposite proportions for third country nationals, where 52% said, yes, I'm interested, and 23% said, no, I'm not interested. This corresponds, by the way, with findings from the literature that studies the integration effects of naturalization, that shows that they are much stronger for third country nationals, especially those from lower income countries. So Austrian citizenship has been restrictive for a long time, but at the same time, there have been many reforms. It has been politicized. It's high on the political domestic agenda. Virtually every coalition government program since the late 1990s has included some intentions to reform citizenship law, and usually to make it stricter and to tighten it up. So the exception is, by the way, interestingly, the current coalition government of the Conservatives and the Greens, where there is not a single word about naturalization and citizenship in a very lengthy 300-page government program. And the reason for that is very simply that there is absolutely no possible consensus between the two coalition partners on that issue. The Conservatives being very keen on tightening up and the Greens on liberalizing it. There was also a lot of ad hoc legislation in response to migration or security crisis. So typically, the terrorist attacks in Vienna on 2nd of November last year immediately led to a proposal by the government to tighten to make it easier to deprive Austrian foreign fighters of their Austrian citizenship. There were some liberalizing reforms that were mostly ordered by the Constitutional Court, that sometimes struck down certain provisions as being discriminatory in violation of international law, or that has constitutional status in Austria, or the Austrian Constitution itself. So to sum it up, the overall trend of these reforms can be described as increasingly restrictive, also as more and more complex. The Austrian citizenship law used to be very simple up to the mid-1990s, and then by adding more and more amendments, for political reasons that have to do with signaling and symbolic politics, it became ever more complex and difficult to handle. That's, by the way, also true for Austrian law on immigration and residence permits. On the other hand, one has to say more naturalizations are now based on entitlements compared to the more discretionary regime in the 80s and 90s. The 6 years fast track naturalization is usually seen as a legal entitlement, but because of the very high hurdles and conditions that come with it, the numbers have not increased, they have decreased. Let me also mention the other important aspect of citizenship, which is migrants' voting rights. So there is a possibility that people can still be part of the political community without changing their citizenship if non-citizen residents are granted voting rights. And there was an effort, so there were, in a way, Austria has responded to migration in the era of voting rights in a quite revealing way. In 1990, there was a Constitutional Court decision that national voting rights need to be extended to Austrian migrants abroad. And now it's very easy actually for Austrian expats to cast their vote in Austrian national elections. This has been more gradually liberalized, the transnational voting rights of Austrian citizens. On the other hand, when the Vienna municipal and provincial government proposed and the parliament adopted a law to extend local voting rights, not at the level of the province or the city, but only at the level of urban districts inside the city. And they felt they could do this because that's not a matter of the federal constitution. So they proposed to extend the right to vote in urban districts from EU citizens to third country nationals. And that was immediately contradicted by the conservatives, and it was struck down by the Constitutional Court in 2004, invoking the argument that according to Article 1 of the Constitution, Austria is a democratic republic. Its law emerges from the people, and the people are its citizens and nobody else. So non-citizens cannot possibly vote. I will skip that slide also for lack of time. This is just a list of the more important reforms of the citizenship law since 1980. And I will just quickly suggest, in terms of evaluation, what the citizenship regime does to immigration or to Austria as an immigration society. So on the one hand, it increases an integration deficit. Many of you will probably know the article by Heinmüller and Hangartner in APSR, where they argue that naturalization is a catalyst, not a crown of integration. So with a quasi-experiment, they prove the causal effect of naturalization on further immigrant integration in terms of income, for example, in the labor market. Peters, Fink, and Schmetz also have a very interesting paper where they show that naturalization, the positive integration effect of naturalization is strongest if naturalization is possible and takes place about 4 to 5 years after entry. But if it takes much longer and if the conditions are very difficult, then the integration effects taper off because the remaining population that might consider naturalization is already integrated or is no longer interested in citizenship. Finally, the lack of Austrian citizenship specifically for second generations has a very deplorable effect, which is it keeps a large population deportable. There was recently a big debate in Austria about the deportation of 4 children of failed asylum seekers. 3 of them were in school. And, people were rubbing their eyes. How is it possible that these people are taken out of the school, and deported to Armenia and Georgia because their parents don't get asylum status? Don't they have an independent right to stay in Austria? And the answer is no. In other countries, they might have been citizens because of some form of conditional soli or socialization-based access to citizenship. The other impact of that blocked regime is a democratic deficit. In Austria, the general voting age is 16. So in the age group 16 plus, 15% of the Austrian population don't have voting rights. And in Vienna elections, in the last Vienna elections in October, it was 30%. Because Vienna is an immigration hub. And in some urban districts inside Vienna, it's more than 50%. The majority of the population doesn't have access to democratic representation at any level. What does that do? It reduces electoral incentives for politicians to represent the interests of migrant populations. It encourages the political neglect of immigrant areas that are then branded as problem areas where parallel societies develop, and it generally diminishes the democratic legitimacy of laws if a large part of the population isn't involved in electing representatives that adopt these laws. So let me conclude by quickly summing up my 3 explanations for that state of affairs. First, the first explanation has to do with political parties and the party system and the kind of coalitions between parties that are possible in Austria's PR electoral system. What we see is in the general literature on comparing politics and citizenship that liberalizing reforms have been mostly promoted by center-left governments and blocked where the right-wing populist parties were electorally strong, even where they were not in government, not in the coalition, but where they could challenge the centrist parties sufficiently strongly, then these centrist parties shied away from liberalizing citizenship. That's very clearly a story that applies to Austria. There hasn't been a center-left legislative majority since '83. The FPÖ, the Freedom Party, has been electorally very strong already since '86. So Austria was a very early case of this right-wing nativist populism. And the conservatives reacted to this already in the late '90s by claiming issue ownership on citizenship matters, particularly by saying we defend the high value of Austrian citizenship that must not be given away too easily because it would be devalued thereby. So the big question is, what about the Social Democrats that have been the leading partner in most coalition governments until the 2000s, and then again, in the mid 2010s? And the answer is the Social Democrats have massively lost working class voters to the Freedomites. And for that, they were very, very cautious in claiming issue ownership over things that were seen as too inclusive for immigrants, who were seen as the group that was blamed by the right-wing populists and that made them lose voters. So what we see is generally a politicization of the issue from the right that is very strong, and we see a weak politicization generally from the left. And even among the activists and the Green Party and the small Liberal Party that do take up the issue on the more progressive side, you find them often emphasizing humanitarian issues more strongly than civic issues like access to citizenship. And some of them deliberately shy away from campaigning on citizenship issues because they are committed to post-national ideas. They want to disconnect political participation rights, for example, from citizenship altogether. Therefore, they wouldn't be campaigning so much for naturalization and use soli. So that's my first explanation, party politics. The second one has to do with the immigration citizenship nexus. Sam Schmidt, who is in the audience, has written and is preparing an important thesis on the question whether there is a trade-off between open immigration policies and open citizenship policies. And in many cases, what he and others find is there is not a trade-off, but there is often also congruence. So parties that are more liberal on immigration tend to be also more liberal on citizenship, which again points back to the coherence of party ideology as being probably important in that field. In the Austrian case, I would tell the following story. Immigration has been seen as largely out of control. When Austria stopped recruiting guest workers, it didn't replace this with another economic immigration program like Australia and Canada do. But it experienced all immigration basically as uncontrolled and out of control. Family reunification, EU accession brought in lots of new migrants and asylum seekers. So there was this perceived loss of control that could be easily politicized by the right. The response to this was a slogan, we need to integrate those who are already here before we can have new immigrants. But since there was no control over new immigration to a large extent, that slogan was self-defeating. And the response to this was to, in a way, the effect was to define integration as an ever-moving target. You couldn't possibly meet it because there were always new people coming in. The so-called refugee crisis in 2015-16 was the high point of that discourse. So you could never ever say, okay, now we are done with controlling immigration. Now we can finally move and help with integration and become more open and inclusive. We never got to that point. There are some other issues, but looking at the time, I will probably just skip the rest of the slide and come to my last substantive hypothesis, which has to do with the way Austrian national identity was constructed after World War II. So you have to know that Austria, after World War I, was the leftover territory of the Habsburg monarchy, where there was an elite consensus that the state couldn't survive and should eventually join Germany. So it was only annexation by Hitler Germany put an end to that elite. Tell an affirmative story about Austrian national identity and independence. That led to a kind of very strange construction of national identity that was not explicitly civic, but couldn't also be explicitly ethnic, because the ethnic identities were seen as being German. And we wanted to get away from the German, pan-German nationalism that had led to the historic disaster of 1938. So the effect of this is in a lack of a republican form of civic identity that has also to do with the continuity of the old interwar constitution that was reinstated instead of, for example, in Germany, creating a new basic law. The lack of a catalog of fundamental rights. Our rights catalog goes back to the Habsburg monarchy, 1867. So there was nothing really to identify Austria as a civic nation. And the very late coping with the Nazi past that really started massively only with the Waldheim affair in also 1986. And what happened after that is when finally Austria tried to make up, especially for the lack of coping with the Nazi past, is the response to this was you could no longer be a respectable German, pan-German nationalist in Austria. But the Freedomites discovered another route, which was to become ultra-Austrian nationalists. Austrian patriotism took on a cultural connotation, and it was very easy to find how to define this Austrian cultural nation. This was basically by demarcating it from the immigrants, and specifically from Islamic immigrants and immigrants from Turkey, the largest cohort of Islamic immigrants there. So there is a discourse about parallel societies that form in Austria, the importing of homeland politics from Turkey, which is not entirely, there are some facts that show that things are going on that are problematic, but it was meant to tell the Austrians who they not are and why these people cannot belong to them. And the non-toleration of dual citizenship is a case in point, where my suspicion is that Norway, Denmark, Luxembourg have all moved to full toleration. Germany and the Netherlands tolerate dual nationality in 50% or more of all naturalizations currently. They just stick to the rule. In Austria, it's serious. And the reason, I suspect, has a lot to do, again, with Turkish immigrants. There was a case where there was a suspicion that Turkish immigrants, after acquiring Austrian citizenship, reacquired their Turkish citizenship, which led, according to the law, to automatic loss of Austrian nationality if it was discovered by the authorities. The courts eventually struck down efforts to go after these people and to find out whether they were illegal dual nationals. But it just shows that the worry is really about dual loyalty of this particular group of immigrants, which blocks liberalization even for EU citizens and other groups that are seen as less problematic. So here's my concluding slide. I still think there is a possibility of reform. I wouldn't say a probability, and certainly not in the near future. Party positions can change and policy coalitions can change. Austria, too, is a society marked by what is now called the Galtan and globalization cleavages, the axis of green alternative libertarian versus traditional authoritarian and nationalist values. There is a large segment of progressives who don't understand why Austria is still stuck in this mode of denying its reality as an immigration country. But in government coalitions, that could never be properly articulated. And the current coalition between the Greens and Conservatives is just stuck in this dilemma where the Greens cannot move, but they are being blamed also for not taking up the issues in order not to jeopardize the coalition. The second possible change, or the change that I see already, is in civil society discourses, but that happens only in low immigration circumstances. So in 2016, it was very difficult to have that discourse. But in every single election, I'm and my colleagues are called, on interviews with the media. On the democratic deficit, how come that 15% of the population cannot vote? And whenever there are deportations of school kids, there is a debate about the right to stay. And the most obvious answer is citizenship gives you the right to stay. It shouldn't be a humanitarian grant. It should be a right that is connected to your citizenship status. Finally, I see a potential for change through external pressure. For example, with dual citizenship, the Austrians abroad are making moves, as happened in other countries, to campaign for finally being allowed to keep their Austrian nationality when they acquire that of their host country. And also EU citizens inside Austria have been arguing we should have the right to vote, and we are willing to become Austrians, but not if we have to give up our previous nationality. So there is some kind of migration groups that may be able to shake up things a little bit on that front. And Austria has also been affected by international policy diffusion. So borrowing models from other countries, but it has been extremely selective. What it has borrowed from other countries, especially the Netherlands, is the civic integration term, introducing language and civic integration and civic knowledge tests in naturalization, and the anti-terrorist measures, depriving terrorist suspects of their Austrian citizenship. But similar mechanisms of policy diffusion could eventually also lead to a liberalizing trend that we haven't seen yet in this country. So with these rather vague conclusions, I thank for your attention, and I hope there is still some time for Q&A.